I never expected that a leaky roof and a torrential downpour would change my life. But that's exactly what happened when my neighbor, the one I was convinced was the straightest man on the planet, ended up on my doorstep. It wasn't the storm that altered the course of my quiet, predictable existence. It was the moment, days later, when he walked me to my own front door, hooked a single, casual thumb into my belt loop, and simply didn't let go. Let me take you back. My name is Lucas, and at the time, I was a 28-year-old graphic designer who had perfected the art of living alone. My apartment was my sanctuary, a carefully curated space of soft grays, clean lines, and the comforting hum of my computer. I worked from home, which meant my social interactions were often limited to the delivery guy and the occasional awkward nod to a neighbor in the hallway. It wasn't a bad life, just a quiet one. It was a life lived behind a screen, both professionally and personally. From my second-floor window, which overlooked the building's small, perpetually damp courtyard, I had a clear view of the comings and goings of my fellow residents. And for the better part of a year, my attention had been completely monopolized by one person in particular. His name was Caleb. He lived on the fourth floor, and he was, for lack of a better word, my complete opposite. Where I was quiet and contained, Caleb was a man who seemed to take up space in the world effortlessly. He worked in construction, a fact I'd pieced together from the steel-toed boots he left outside his door and the fine layer of dust that sometimes coated his dark hair when he came home in the evenings. He had broad shoulders and strong arms, the kind of casual, physical confidence that I, with my lanky frame and keyboard-honed posture, could only observe with a sense of detached admiration. I watched him. I know that sounds creepy, but it wasn't malicious. It was more like research. I watched him haul groceries up 4 flights of stairs without breaking a sweat. I watched him laugh with friends in the parking lot, the sound carrying up to my open window on warm summer nights. I saw him hold the door for our elderly neighbor, Mrs. Gable, and carry her bags for her, listening patiently as she recounted some story, his head tilted with genuine interest. He was kind, he was handsome, and he was, in my mind, a closed book. He existed in a different world, one of tangible things, of sweat and grit and easy camaraderie with other men who looked just like him. He was the guy you see in a beer commercial, the guy who would undoubtedly end up with a beautiful wife and a golden retriever. He was everything I found attractive and everything I believed I could never have. So, I filed him away under unattainable and contented myself with my quiet observations from a safe distance. My life was a loop of routines. Wake up, make coffee, work, eat lunch at my desk, work some more, make dinner, watch something, sleep. It was a flat, unvarying landscape. Caleb was the one interesting mountain on the horizon, a feature I could look at but never hoped to climb. I told myself I was fine with that. I told myself that the quiet ache in my chest was just loneliness, a generic symptom of modern life, and had nothing to do with the handsome stranger on the fourth floor. I had constructed this entire narrative about him, about us, without ever having more than a 2-sentence conversation. It was always a quick, "Hey, how's it going?" in the mailroom or a simple nod as we passed on the stairs. He was always friendly, with a quick, easy smile that made my stomach do a little flip. But it was the kind of universal friendliness he seemed to show everyone. I was just another face in the building, another part of the scenery of his life, while he had become the main event in the scenery of mine. That's how things were for almost a year. A cycle of quiet observation, of unvoiced longing, and of resigned acceptance. I was the watcher at the window, and he was the man living a life I could only imagine. I had no reason to believe that would ever change. Life doesn't just throw you a bone like that, right? You don't just get to have the thing you want most, especially when you're too afraid to even admit you want it. But then the rain started. It wasn't just rain. It was a deluge, the kind of biblical storm that makes you grateful for a solid roof over your head. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the wind howled like a wounded animal. I spent the evening curled up on my couch, a mug of tea warming my hands, feeling cozy and safe while the world outside was chaos. I felt a strange sense of smug satisfaction, secure in my little fortress while the elements raged. It's funny how quickly that feeling can disappear. Around 11 o'clock, when the storm was at its peak, there was a frantic knocking at my door. It wasn't a polite tap. It was an urgent, percussive sound that cut straight through the noise of the wind and rain. My heart jumped into my throat. Nobody ever knocked on my door this late. My first thought was that it had to be an emergency, maybe a building-wide issue like a fire alarm. I rushed to the door, my mind racing through worst-case scenarios. I peered through the peephole, and my breath caught. It was Caleb. He was soaked to the bone, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, and water was dripping from his chin onto the worn welcome mat. He looked exhausted and frustrated, his usual easygoing expression replaced by a look of sheer desperation. I fumbled with the locks and pulled the door open. "Caleb, are you okay?" He ran a hand through his drenched hair, sending a spray of water across my entryway. "Hey, Lucas. Man, I am so sorry to bother you this late." He gestured vaguely upwards. "My apartment. I think my roof is leaking. Or the window seal broke. There's water coming in everywhere. It's a mess." I stood there for a second, just staring. This was the most I'd ever heard him say at one time. His voice was deeper than I'd imagined, raspy with stress. "Oh wow, that's terrible. Did you call the landlord?" He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Yeah, I called the emergency line. Got a voicemail. I don't think anyone's coming out in this weather. They'll probably get to it tomorrow. Or the day after." He looked down at the puddle forming at his feet, then back at me, his eyes pleading. And this is when the world tilted on its axis. "Look, this is a huge ask, I know. But would there be any chance I could just crash on your couch tonight? I can be out of your hair first thing in the morning. Everything in my place is getting soaked." My brain short-circuited. Caleb. In my apartment. On my couch. The man I'd spent a year watching from a distance was standing on my doorstep, asking to come in. It felt like a scene from a movie, too surreal to be happening in my quiet, boring life. All my carefully constructed walls of distance and observation crumbled in an instant. "Yes," I said, probably a little too quickly. "Of course. Don't be silly. Come in, come in." I stepped back, holding the door wide open, and he gave me a look of such profound relief that it sent a pang through my chest. "Are you sure? I don't want to impose." "It's not an imposition," I insisted, my voice sounding strangely steady despite the frantic beating of my heart. "It's a storm. It's an emergency. Come on, you're getting drenched." He finally stepped inside, bringing the smell of rain and cold night air with him. He stood awkwardly in my small foyer, dripping onto the hardwood floor. He looked around, taking in my space, and I suddenly felt incredibly self-conscious. My clean, minimalist apartment felt sterile and impersonal compared to the vibrant, living energy he radiated, even when soaked and defeated. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft with genuine gratitude. "Seriously, you're a lifesaver." And just like that, the uncrossable distance between the second floor and the fourth floor vanished. The mountain on my horizon had, and probably, decided to come for a visit. I had no idea what to do now that he was here, but as I handed him a stack of dry towels, a single, thrilling thought cut through my anxiety. He was here. He was actually here. The first hour was a blur of practicalities. I gave him the towels and pointed him toward the bathroom. While he was showering, I scrambled around the apartment, tidying things that didn't need tidying, fluffing pillows, and trying to make my couch look like the most comfortable sleeping surface in human history. I felt like I was preparing for a royal visit, my nerves humming with a mixture of excitement and sheer panic. What do you say to the man you've been secretly crushing on when he suddenly camped out in your living room? When he emerged from the bathroom, he was wearing a pair of my gray sweatpants and an old t-shirt I'd given him. They were too short on him, exposing his ankles, and the shirt was tight across his chest and shoulders. Seeing him in my clothes, in my home, was a level of surreal intimacy my brain was not equipped to handle. My carefully ordered world had been completely upended. "Thanks again for this," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. He looked less like the confident construction worker and more like a lost kid. It was surprisingly endearing. "The clothes, the couch, everything. It's really no problem," I said, trying to sound casual. "Can I get you something? Tea? Water? Water would be great. Thanks." I went into the kitchen, my hands trembling slightly as I filled a glass. He followed me and leaned against the counter, watching me. The silence wasn't awkward, exactly, but it was charged. It was the silence of two people who were essentially strangers, suddenly thrust into a situation of forced intimacy. I was acutely aware of his presence, of the space he took up in my small kitchen. I handed him the glass, and our fingers brushed. It was nothing, a fleeting, accidental touch, but a jolt went through me, sharp and electric. I pulled my hand back as if I'd been burned. I wasn't sure if he noticed, but a faint blush crept up my neck anyway. This was going to be harder than I thought. We ended up sitting on the couch, a safe distance between us, talking. Or rather, he talked, and I mostly listened, asking questions to keep him going. He told me about the chaos in his apartment, how he'd used buckets and towels to try and manage the leak until it became a losing battle. He vented his frustration with our landlord, and I found myself nodding along, adding my own complaints. It was easy, surprisingly so. Then the conversation drifted. He asked me what I did for a living, and when I told him I was a graphic designer, his eyes lit up. No way. That's cool. I've always been fascinated by that stuff. I can't even draw a straight line. It's not so much about drawing, I explained, feeling a little more in my element. It's about communication, just with images instead of words. I found myself opening up, telling him about a recent project, showing him some of my work on my laptop. He was genuinely interested. He wasn't just being polite. He leaned in closer to look at the screen, and I was suddenly aware of his scent. Not just the rain anymore, but the clean, simple smell of my soap and a faint, woodsy scent that was all his own. He pointed to a logo I'd designed. How did you even come up with that? It's so simple, but it says everything it needs to. And in that moment, he saw me. Not just as a neighbor, not just a face in the hallway, but as a person with a skill, a passion. He was seeing the part of me that was usually hidden behind a screen. And as I explained my creative process, I started to see him differently, too. Beneath the rugged exterior was a man who was thoughtful, curious, and observant. He had a quiet intelligence that I'd never have guessed at. Later, as I was setting up his bedding on the couch, he picked up a small, framed photo from my bookshelf. It was a picture of me and my sister on a hiking trip years ago. "Is this your girlfriend?" he asked, his tone neutral. My heart did a stutter step. This was it, the moment of truth. I could lie, or deflect, but something about the honesty of the evening made me want to tell the truth. "No," I said, my voice quiet but steady. "That's my sister." He nodded, placing the frame carefully back on the shelf. He didn't ask if I had a girlfriend. He didn't ask anything else. He just said, "You guys look happy," but the way he looked at me after that, it felt different. There was a new softness in his eyes, a flicker of something I couldn't quite name. Or maybe I was just projecting my own desperate hope onto him. That night, I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of him breathing in my living room. The storm outside had passed, leaving behind a profound quiet. But inside me, a different kind of storm was just beginning to brew. He was no longer just a fantasy, a distant figure I watched from my window. He was a real person, sleeping 20 feet away, wearing my clothes. And for the first time, the mountain on the horizon didn't seem so impossibly high after all. The landlord, predictably, was slow to act. One night turned into 2, and then 3. Caleb's temporary stay on my couch started to feel less like an emergency measure and more like a strange, domestic routine. We fell into an easy rhythm. I'd wake up to the smell of coffee because he was always up before me, a habit from his early work schedule. He'd be sitting at my small dining table, scrolling through his phone, and he'd pass me a mug as I shuffled into the kitchen. "Morning," he'd say, with that sleepy, crooked smile that was quickly becoming my favorite thing in the world. "Morning," I'd reply, feeling a ridiculous surge of joy at this simple, shared ritual. During the day, he would go to work, and I would work from home, the apartment falling back into its usual quiet. But it was a different kind of quiet now. It was filled with the ghost of his presence, the indentation his head had left on the couch pillow, the scent of his shampoo lingering in the bathroom, the extra mug sitting by the sink. I found it hard to concentrate, my mind constantly drifting to the evening when he would return. He'd come home tired and covered in dust, and the first thing he'd do is drop his heavy work boots by the door and head for the shower. While he was cleaning up, I'd start making dinner. I'm not much of a cook, but I found myself putting in more effort, trying out new recipes I found online. I wanted to impress him, to take care of him in some small way. It was a flimsy excuse to nurture the burgeoning connection between us. We would eat together at my table, talking about our days. He told me about the politics of the job site, the satisfaction of seeing a building take shape from nothing. I told him about the frustrations of demanding clients and the small victories of a design that finally clicked into place. We were learning the textures of each other's lives, a process that felt both thrilling and terrifyingly intimate. One evening, after dinner, we were cleaning up in the kitchen. It was a small space, and we kept bumping into each other as I washed and he dried. The air was thick with unspoken things. I was so focused on not dropping a slippery plate that I didn't notice him watching me until I turned to hand him another one. He wasn't looking at the plate. He was looking at my face, his expression unreadable. "What?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He just shook his head, a small smile playing on his lips. "Nothing," he said softly. "Just, you've got a little bit of foam on your nose." He reached out, his fingers warm and calloused, and gently wiped the soap suds away. His touch lingered for a fraction of a second too long, a soft, deliberate pressure against my skin. The entire world seemed to shrink down to that single point of contact. My breath hitched, and I saw something flicker in his eyes, the same thing I'd seen when he looked at my photo, but stronger this time. It was a spark of recognition, of something shared. He pulled his hand back, and the moment was over. He cleared his throat and went back to drying the plate, but the space between us had changed. The casual, accidental touches of the past few days suddenly felt charged with new meaning. The line between roommate and something else was becoming dangerously blurred. The turning point, the moment that would replay in my mind for days, happened on the third night. We had decided to walk to the corner store to grab some ice cream, a mutual craving that felt like a celebration of our strange, temporary domesticity. The air was cool and clean after the storm, and the streets glistened under the orange glow of the streetlights. We walked side by side, our shoulders occasionally brushing. The conversation was light and easy. We talked about terrible movies we loved, about our favorite childhood snacks, about the weirdest jobs we'd ever had. I felt myself relaxing completely in his presence for the first time. The constant thrum of anxiety in my chest had quieted, replaced by a warm, hopeful hum. I felt happy, genuinely, uncomplicatedly happy. When we got back to the apartment building, we walked up the 2 flights of stairs to my door in comfortable silence. The easy camaraderie of the evening settled around us. I stopped in front of my door, digging in my pocket for my keys, the familiar routine feeling different tonight. It felt like I was coming home with him, not just to a place where he happened to be staying. "Well," I said, my keys finally in hand. "Thanks for the ice cream walk." "Anytime," he said, his voice low. He was standing a little closer than necessary, and I could feel the warmth radiating from him. I looked up and met his gaze, and my heart started to pound all over again. I turned to the door, fumbling with the lock. My hands were shaking. I was so aware of him standing behind me, of the quiet energy between us. I was just about to push the key in when I felt a gentle pressure on my back. I froze. He had reached out and hooked his thumb into the back belt loop of my jeans. It wasn't a grab or a pull. It was a simple, quiet act of possession. His thumb rested firmly against the small of my back, anchoring me in place. He didn't say anything. He just held on. My entire nervous system went into overdrive. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could feel was the solid, warm pressure of his thumb, a single point of contact that was screaming 1,000 things I was too terrified to acknowledge. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. A full minute might have passed, or maybe it was only 10 seconds. Time seemed to warp and bend around this one, shocking gesture. It was so out of character, so bold, and yet so subtle. It wasn't aggressive, it was questioning. It was a physical sentence without a period, waiting for me to provide the punctuation. My mind was a chaotic swirl of questions. Was this happening? Was I imagining it? Was this a joke? But there was nothing funny about the intensity in the air. This felt deliberate. This felt real. I could feel the heat of his body close behind me, could hear his soft, even breathing. He was waiting for me to turn around, to pull away, to do something. I remained perfectly still, my back to him, the key hovering just inches from the lock. My whole body was rigid with a mixture of terror and a wild, soaring hope that threatened to tear me apart. He didn't let go. He just stood there, his thumb hooked in my belt loop, holding me there in the hallway, suspended in a moment that would change everything. Eventually, as if waking from a trance, he let go. His hand dropped away, and the sudden absence of his touch was as shocking as its arrival. I heard him take a small, sharp breath. "Sorry," he mumbled, his voice sounding rough and uncertain. I should go check on my place. See if the landlord's people left a note or anything." He didn't wait for my response. I heard his footsteps moving quickly down the hall, and then the sound of him taking the stairs up to the 4th floor. I stood frozen in front of my door for what felt like an eternity, my back still tingling where his thumb had been. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. Finally, with a trembling hand, I managed to get the key in the lock and stumbled inside my apartment. I closed the door and leaned against it, my legs feeling weak. The apartment was silent and empty, the comfortable domesticity of the past few days completely shattered. All that was left was the echo of that one, stunning moment in the hallway. I replayed it in my mind, over and over again. The casual walk, the easy conversation, and then that touch. What did it mean? My mind, always prone to overanalysis, went into hyperdrive. I dissected every second of the encounter. The way he had stood so close, the low timbre of his voice, and the belt loop. God, the belt loop. It was such a specific, intimate gesture. It wasn't a friendly pat on the back or a casual hand on the shoulder. It was possessive. It was a way of saying, "Stay, don't go yet," wasn't it? But then the fear and self-doubt crept in, as they always did. Maybe it was a mistake. A weird, impulsive gesture he regretted instantly. Maybe he was just being strange. People do strange things, right? Maybe he'd been drinking before we went out, though I hadn't smelled anything on him. I spun out a dozen different scenarios, each one more unlikely than the last, all in an effort to explain away the one explanation my heart desperately wanted to be true. The hope was a fragile, terrifying thing. The idea that Caleb, the man I'd admired from a distance for so long, could possibly feel something for me. It was too big, too world-altering to fully comprehend. If I let myself believe it, and I was wrong, the fall would be devastating. It was safer to assume I had misunderstood, to retreat back into my shell of quiet observation and protect myself from the potential pain of rejection. The next day was agonizing. I woke up early, my mind still churning. I waited, listening for the sound of him moving around in the living room, but there was nothing. I crept out of my bedroom to find the couch empty, the blankets folded neatly at one end. A note was sitting on the coffee table. My stomach clenched as I picked it up. It was written in a messy, masculine scrawl on a piece of paper torn from my own notepad. "Hey, landlord finally sent a crew over late last night. All sorted. Thanks for everything, Lucas. You were a lifesaver." Caleb, that was it. He was gone. Just like that, our strange little bubble of domesticity had burst. He didn't even say goodbye in person. The finality of it felt like a punch to the gut. The note was friendly, grateful, but also distant. There was no mention of the moment at the door, no hint of anything other than neighborly gratitude. My hope plummeted. Of course, it was just an emergency, and now the emergency was over. I had built up the whole thing in my head, assigning meaning to accidental touches and late-night conversations. The belt loop incident was just a bizarre anomaly, a moment of weirdness he was probably embarrassed about and wanted to forget. I felt like a fool. The day passed in a miserable haze. I tried to work, but I couldn't focus. I kept staring at the empty couch, at the neatly folded blankets. The silence in the apartment was deafening now. It was no longer the comfortable quiet of my solitude. It was the heavy silence of absence, of loss. I had gotten a taste of something I never thought I could have, and now it was gone. I avoided my window, not wanting to risk seeing him. I didn't know what I would do if we ran into each other in the hallway. Would I act normal? Could I? The thought of facing him, of having to pretend that moment didn't happen, filled me with a cold dread. The chasm between the 2nd and 4th floors felt wider and more impassable than ever before. My heart ached with the weight of what I thought I had almost had. By evening, I had worked myself into a state of resigned melancholy. I ordered a pizza I didn't want and sat on my couch, flipping through TV channels with the sound off. I was just about to give up and go to bed, to put an end to this miserable day, when there was a knock on my door. It was a soft, hesitant knock this time, completely different from the desperate pounding during the storm. My heart leaped into my throat. I knew, somehow, that it was him. For a moment, I considered not answering. It would be easier, safer, but I couldn't. I had to know. I walked to the door, my hands clammy, and opened it. Caleb was standing there, looking just as nervous as I felt. He wasn't the confident, easygoing man from the construction site, or even the grateful house guest. He looked uncertain, vulnerable. He was wearing his own clothes again, and he was twisting his hands together in front of him. "Hey," he said, his voice quiet. "Hey," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. An awkward silence stretched between us. He wouldn't meet my eyes, focusing instead on a spot on the floor just past my feet. Can I come in for a second?" he asked. I nodded, stepping back to let him in. He walked into the living room, but remained standing in the middle of the floor, looking out of place and uncomfortable. I closed the door and turned to face him, my arms crossed over my chest in a defensive posture I wasn't even aware I was taking. I wanted to apologize," he started, finally looking at me. His eyes were full of a nervous energy that mirrored my own. "For being so weird yesterday, and for just leaving that note this morning. It was a crappy way to say thanks." I just shrugged, not trusting my voice. I didn't know what to say. Was he here to apologize for the belt loop? To smooth things over so we could go back to being polite, distant neighbors? The thought sent a fresh wave of disappointment through me. "The thing is," he continued, taking a deep breath as if steeling himself. "My apartment, the leak wasn't that bad. I mean, it was real, but I could have stayed with my brother. He lives like 20 minutes from here." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process what he was saying. "What? Why didn't you?" He finally met my gaze, and his expression was raw with sincerity. "Because I wanted an excuse to talk to you, Lucas." The words hung in the air between us, charged and electric. My defensive posture melted away, my arms falling to my sides. "Me?" I managed to choke out. He nodded, a faint, self-deprecating smile on his lips. "Yeah, you. I've seen you around for months. In the mailroom, at your window." I kept trying to think of a way to start a conversation that wasn't just, "How about this weather?" When the storm hit, it just seemed like an opportunity one couldn't pass up. It was a stupid, overly dramatic plan, I know. My heart was hammering so hard I was sure he could hear it. This whole time, while I was watching him, he had been watching me too. The thought was staggering. "And last night," he went on, his voice dropping lower. "At the door, the belt loop thing. God, that was so dumb. I didn't want the night to end. I didn't want to go back to my empty apartment, and for us, to be over." I panicked, and I reached out. He shook his head, looking embarrassed. I really like you, Lucas. A lot. And I've been terrified that I completely misread everything and made you uncomfortable." All the air left my lungs in a rush. It was real. It was all real. The hope I had tried so hard to squash bloomed in my chest, huge and brilliant and overwhelming. I felt a laugh bubble up, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. "You didn't misread anything," I said, my voice shaking with emotion. "Caleb, I've been half in love with you for a year, watching you from my window like some kind of creepy stalker." A look of profound relief washed over his face, so intense it almost buckled him. He took a step closer, then another, until he was standing right in front of me. Really, I confirmed, a wide, trembling smile spreading across my face. He reached out, but not for my belt loop this time. He cupped my face in his hands, his palms warm and slightly rough against my skin. His thumbs gently stroked my cheekbones. "So it's okay if I do this?" he whispered. He didn't wait for an answer. He leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't a questioning, tentative kiss. It was a kiss of certainty, of relief, of pent-up feelings finally released. It was firm and gentle and perfect. It tasted of hope and second chances. I melted into him, my hands coming up to rest on his waist, pulling him closer. The chasm between us, the distance I had believed to be uncrossable, vanished completely in that one, breathtaking moment. The weeks that followed felt like waking up from a long, gray dream into a world of vibrant color. Caleb and I didn't rush. We took our time, building something real on the foundation of our strange, rain-soaked beginning. Our first official date was a walk in the park, holding hands, the simple act feeling like a profound declaration. We learned each other's rhythms, not as temporary roommates, but as partners. My apartment, once my solitary sanctuary, became our space. His scuffed work boots found a permanent home by the door next to my sneakers. His sketchbook, a secret talent he'd shyly revealed, ended up on my coffee table. He had a surprisingly delicate hand, filling pages with detailed drawings of buildings, trees, and occasionally, a sketch of me, hunched over my laptop, completely unaware. Seeing myself through his eyes was a revelation. He saw a focus and intensity one never recognized in myself. My quiet, predictable life was transformed. It was now filled with laughter, with the sound of 2 sets of footsteps, with late-night conversations that stretched until dawn. We discovered a shared love for old black-and-white movies and a mutual dislike for olives. He introduced me to the simple pleasure of a cold beer after a long day's work, and I introduced him to the complex world of fonts and color theory, which he found endlessly fascinating. We talked about the beginning, of course. We laughed about his ridiculous, dramatic plan to get my attention. I was going to just knock and ask to borrow a cup of sugar, he admitted one night as we were curled up on the couch, my head resting on his chest. But that felt so cliché. A catastrophic flood seemed much more memorable. It was definitely memorable, I agreed, smiling. I thought about the night of the belt loop incident, the memory no longer a source of anxiety, but a cherished touchstone. It was the moment the fantasy became a possibility. I'm glad you panicked, I told him softly. I don't think I ever